At 100 years old, Mel Brooks has spent an extraordinary lifetime making audiences laugh. Behind the jokes, however, was a filmmaker who never easily forgot betrayal and had little patience for performers who disrupted the carefully controlled chaos of his productions. From Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein to The Producers and Spaceballs, Brooks created a comedy empire surrounded by unforgettable stars. Yet not every professional relationship ended with laughter. Some actors challenged his direction, resisted his methods, or brought personalities that clashed with the collaborative spirit he demanded. And surprisingly, several of those names were already legends. So which performers fell out of favor with Mel Brooks, and what happened that made him remember those experiences for decades? The one thing Mel Brooks could never tolerate. Mel Brooks had a unique way of running a film set. It might have looked chaotic from the outside, but underneath that madness was precision. Every line needed its rhythm, every reaction served a purpose, and every pause had to land at exactly the right moment. Brooks could embrace eccentric personalities and even welcomed complete absurdity. What he could not accept was an actor who began acting as though the production revolved around them rather than the comedy. Inside the world Brooks created, performers generally fell into two categories. Some enhanced the madness and became unforgettable parts of it. Others struggled against the rhythm and disappeared beneath it. The performers who understood the system became legends. Those who resisted often became distant memories. Brooks publicly praised countless actors. He celebrated them at award ceremonies, complimented them in interviews, and often described them as brilliant. But behind the scenes, he apparently maintained a very different mental record. People who ignored his direction, wasted production time, or behaved as though they were more important than the movie could lose his trust permanently. As Brooks became more successful, his expectations only became stronger. If an actor served the comedy, they could return again and again. But if their ego interfered with the production, Brooks could quietly move on. That philosophy shaped many of his professional relationships and became especially evident with 5 very different performers. His philosophy was never formally written down. Instead, it existed in the way his productions operated. Brooks believed his particular brand of comedy depended on everyone surrendering, at least temporarily, to the joke. The laughter had to be more important than any individual performer. When someone refused to accept that principle, Brooks believed the entire production could suffer. Protecting the creative rhythm became more important than preserving a particular relationship. Over the decades, that attitude created a pattern of professional exclusions that could last for years. Talent alone was never enough. Brooks wanted performers who could become part of something larger than themselves. Without that willingness, even extraordinary talent could become a problem. 5 actors learned that lesson in very different ways. Frank Langella, the Broadway star who could not let go of the drama. On paper, Frank Langella seemed like an ideal choice. He was tall, charismatic, and already celebrated for his acclaimed portrayal of Dracula on Broadway. When Mel Brooks began developing Dracula, Dead and Loving It, Langella appeared to be a natural candidate. He knew the character extremely well. But that familiarity became part of the problem. Brooks had no intention of making a serious Gothic drama. He wanted ridiculous physical comedy, exaggerated reactions, pratfalls, and a vampire capable of delivering a dramatic speech one moment and completely humiliating himself the next. Brooks wanted the entire world of Dracula turned into controlled comic chaos. Langella reportedly approached the material with the seriousness of a classical actor. From the beginning, the two approaches seemed incompatible. Rehearsals became slower. Brooks was accustomed to maintaining a fast-moving environment, but Langella did not appear to respond naturally to the comedic rhythm. He did not improvise freely and delivered his dialogue with the weight and seriousness of a dramatic performance. Brooks tried different approaches. He offered notes, made subtle adjustments, and introduced lines designed to create more physical comedy. Yet Langella continued approaching the material in essentially the same manner. Scenes that were supposed to move quickly became heavier and more deliberate. Eventually, a test reading reportedly made the situation clear. Brooks gave Langella a line that began dramatically but was intended to end in a physical gag. The reaction apparently confirmed that their creative approaches were simply too different. By the end of the week, Langella was replaced by Leslie Nielsen. There was no major public confrontation. Nielsen understood exactly what Brooks wanted. He could play absurd situations with complete seriousness while allowing the comedy to explode around him. The official explanation was creative differences. But the underlying issue appeared to be more fundamental. Brooks needed someone willing to surrender to the comedic chaos, while Langella remained committed to the dramatic presence that had made him famous. Langella left quietly and did not publicly attack Brooks over the experience. Brooks likewise did not publicly insult him. When discussing the film, however, Brooks focused on how perfectly Leslie Nielsen fit the role. Langella's name gradually disappeared from the conversation. The lesson was straightforward. In Brooks' comedy, talent mattered, but flexibility mattered too. An actor could be brilliant and still be wrong for the machine Brooks had created. Gene Wilder, the creative partner who became a distant friend. Some professional disappointments hurt more when they involve a friend. For Mel Brooks, Gene Wilder represented far more than another actor. He was one of Brooks' most important creative partners. Together, they helped redefine American comedy through The Producers, Blazing Saddles, and Young Frankenstein. Their chemistry was extraordinary. They seemed capable of completing each other's thoughts, finding humor in unfinished ideas, and transforming simple concepts into memorable comedy. But after Young Frankenstein, their relationship changed. Wilder had been deeply involved in the writing of Young Frankenstein, while Brooks directed the film and fought to preserve its distinctive black-and-white presentation. The movie became a classic. Wilder, however, had another project he was passionate about, The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother. Wilder wrote the screenplay, wanted to direct it, and hoped Mel Brooks would produce it. Brooks declined. The refusal was not necessarily a judgment on the script itself. Instead, Brooks reportedly believed Wilder was not yet ready to direct. To Wilder, however, the decision felt deeply disappointing. He expected the support of a longtime creative partner and instead received distance. Wilder eventually made the movie without Brooks. Familiar faces such as Marty Feldman and Madeline Kahn appeared, but the creative partnership that had produced their earlier magic was gone. For years, the two men remained apart. There was no spectacular public feud or dramatic exchange of insults. Instead, their relationship simply became distant. Two people who had once worked together effortlessly were now moving in separate directions. Eventually, they crossed paths again at an event. Their reunion was reportedly understated rather than dramatic. There was no huge confrontation or emotional reconciliation. There was simply a handshake, a few jokes, and the beginning of a cautious return to friendship. But the professional partnership never returned. Brooks had once regarded Wilder as someone he could trust with unfinished creative ideas. After their disagreement, that level of trust never completely recovered. Their relationship remained respectful, but the creative connection that had once produced some of comedy's greatest films was no longer there. Wilder's absence became noticeable in Brooks' later projects. The relationship had not necessarily ended because of hatred. It ended because something fundamental had been damaged: trust. Chevy Chase, the comedian Mel Brooks never brought into his world. Mel Brooks seemed to have an instinct for determining whether a performer would fit his creative environment. With Chevy Chase, that instinct apparently told him to keep his distance. The two men never made a film together. According to the story, that was not an accident. During the 1980s and early 1990s, Chase was one of Hollywood's most recognizable comedy stars. He had box office appeal, a distinctive deadpan style, and enormous name recognition. Studios naturally saw him as a valuable casting possibility. Brooks, however, reportedly rejected the idea repeatedly. The issue was not whether Chase was funny. He clearly was. The concern was whether his personality would fit within Brooks' collaborative approach. Brooks wanted performers who could support one another, share the spotlight, and allow another actor to land the biggest laugh. Chase had developed a reputation for being sharp, confident, and sometimes difficult in collaborative environments. Brooks apparently saw a performer who could dominate a room rather than disappear into the ensemble. The closest connection came during casting discussions for Spaceballs. Chase was reportedly considered for the role of Dark Helmet, a part that ultimately went to Rick Moranis. Moranis understood how to make himself part of the joke. He could play the character completely straight while allowing the absurdity around him to become even funnier. Brooks apparently felt Chase's style would have created a different kind of energy. For Brooks, comedy was not simply about delivering clever lines. The performer had to believe in the ridiculous world being created. The joke had to be played sincerely, no matter how absurd it was. Chase and Brooks eventually had a brief meeting, but nothing came from it. There was no famous feud and no dramatic public confrontation. Chase simply never became part of the Mel Brooks comedy universe. That distinction is important. He was not necessarily rejected because he lacked talent. He simply did not fit the particular rhythm Brooks demanded. Harvey Korman, brilliance that created friction. Harvey Korman was one of the most talented performers ever to appear in a Mel Brooks production. On screen, their partnership produced unforgettable moments in films such as Blazing Saddles, High Anxiety, and History of the World, Part 1. Korman possessed extraordinary comedic timing. He could deliver a long monologue, hold an expression for exactly the right amount of time, and then allow the entire performance to collapse into absurdity. But behind the scenes, the relationship was reportedly more complicated. Korman had developed his own style through the Carol Burnett Show. He was accustomed to sketch comedy, flexible scripts, and environments where performers could experiment with material. Brooks worked differently. He approached comedy almost like a conductor directing an orchestra. Lines, pauses, reactions, and movements all had a specific purpose. When a performer moved too far away from the planned rhythm, the entire scene could change. Korman was reportedly willing to challenge that structure. Their tensions became particularly noticeable during High Anxiety. Brooks cast Korman as Dr. Montague, a character who was supposed to embody a specific kind of exaggerated comedic menace. Korman wanted to develop the character further and introduce his own ideas. Brooks, however, believed the material had already been constructed and simply needed to be performed as written. That disagreement created tension. As production continued, Korman reportedly questioned blocking, challenged certain deliveries, and pushed for changes. Brooks, who could normally improvise quickly with his actors, became increasingly less willing to debate every decision. According to the story, the atmosphere gradually became uncomfortable. There were no major shouting matches or explosive confrontations. Instead, disagreements played out quietly, with every scene becoming another negotiation. By the final stages of production, the relationship had become noticeably distant. Korman's performance remained strong because he was too experienced to allow personal tension to destroy his work. But after High Anxiety, Korman did not become a regular part of Brooks' later projects. The separation did not necessarily come from hatred. It appeared to come from exhaustion. Korman brought tremendous talent, but the creative relationship required more effort than Brooks wanted to continue investing. Their partnership had reached its limit. Jerry Lewis, the genius Mel Brooks preferred to admire from afar. Mel Brooks respected extraordinary comedic talent, but he had little patience for personalities he considered difficult. Jerry Lewis represented both extremes. Lewis was unquestionably a major figure in comedy. Like Brooks, he wrote, directed, performed, and developed his own distinctive comedic language. Their names were often associated because both men had enormous influence on the genre. It would have seemed logical for them to collaborate. Yet it never happened. The reason, according to the story, was not that Brooks failed to recognize Lewis' talent. He did. Instead, Brooks reportedly believed Lewis' personality could make collaboration difficult. Lewis had a reputation for having strong creative opinions, rewriting material, challenging directors, and dominating the creative space around him. Brooks preferred an ensemble in which everyone understood that the movie itself came first. At one point, Lewis was reportedly considered for a supporting role in Life Stinks. The possibility was ultimately rejected. Brooks did not want a performer who might compete with the film itself. His philosophy was that every actor should contribute to the larger comedic structure rather than attempt to become the entire center of attention. The two men did meet privately at one point. A mutual acquaintance arranged a dinner where they could speak away from the pressure of a studio environment. Brooks reportedly arrived interested in the possibility of working together. Lewis arrived late and spent much of the conversation discussing the future of American comedy. Brooks listened, but the meeting apparently convinced him that the partnership would not work. Afterward, the idea of collaborating was effectively abandoned. There was no major public feud. Neither man needed to publicly attack the other. They simply remained separate. For Brooks, the question was never whether Lewis possessed enough talent. He obviously did. The question was whether that talent could function inside an ensemble without overwhelming it. Brooks built his films around balance. Characters could be outrageous, but they still had to serve the overall joke. Lewis' highly individualistic style did not seem compatible with that philosophy. And once Brooks decided that a performer could not fit into his creative system, talent alone was unlikely to change his mind. The real reason Mel Brooks cut them off. The common thread connecting these 5 stories was not a lack of talent. Quite the opposite. Every one of these performers possessed remarkable ability. The issue was compatibility. Mel Brooks' comedy depended on a strange kind of collective surrender. Everyone involved had to temporarily accept that the joke was more important than personal ego. His productions could look completely chaotic, but that chaos worked because there was an underlying structure. Every performer had a role in maintaining it. When someone resisted that structure, Brooks believed the entire comedic machine could suffer. That helps explain why some of his professional decisions appeared so permanent. They were not necessarily driven by personal hatred. From Brooks' perspective, they were ways of protecting the creative environment he had spent decades building. The public saw the laughter, the outrageous characters, and the unforgettable scenes. Behind those moments was a filmmaker who understood exactly how much control was required to make chaos look effortless. Across decades, the same principle continued to appear.